Hi, I'm here with Nicole Zeidler from the Family Business Consulting Group, and we're talking about leaders replacing leaders, or what we commonly refer to as NextGen development. And I really like this frame of leaders replacing leaders. So, Nicole, how do we develop and grow human capital within a family enterprise?
One of the first steps that a family business needs to take is to figure out what the business itself needs, what sort of skill set, what talent they specifically need to develop within the next generation. From there, you need to clearly define roles and responsibilities. It's tough for a next generation family member to enter the business if there aren't those clear-cut lines, those expectations laid out, any sort of structure. It's very easy then for a next generation family member to flail and to not be successful if there isn't an outline laid out for them.
In this role transition, it's also expectations and defining the business needs. So as these things start to come into play, what does a next-gen leader need to kind of know in order to do these things well?
So a next-gen leader at first needs to know the family business history. This becomes very important, especially once you're into the third generation beyond, because they probably weren't around when a business was founded or know kind of how the business got to today. So knowing the family history, also knowing all of the family policies from a family employment policy or a shareholder agreement, buy-sell agreement, things like that. They need to know the kind of the lay of the land before they're approaching entering the business. You don't want to kind of throw that at them, right at the point as they're ready to enter the business. They need to know how to get into the business and what will be expected of them before they reach that point. They also need to have some very solid industry knowledge and understanding, as well as kind of what I call business 101, being able to read financial statements, kind of interpret what the financial story is, what that means, before they can successfully become a contributing member of a family business.
So one of the things that you described is really the next-gen leader really needs to know the heart of the business. Mm-hmm. What if the family has had a little bit of lack of transparency, or there's some tight controls around information? How does a next-gen leader kind of enter into that discussion with the older generation?
That's very, very common. That happens quite a bit. And so one tool I like to have the current leadership do is start to map out what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, kind of keep a timeline of the major decisions being made, and then have the next-gen leader be around, just observe, not ask a lot of questions, but just to be in the room when they're making some of those decisions. Then that helps the next-gen family member get a little bit more knowledge so that they have some foundation where they can start this conversation. And then just by being there, that begins to open up a discussion and gives them kind of some meat to talk about, rather than just blatantly asking, well, how did we get here? What does our business do? What do I need to do? That those are big questions that are tough for the current leadership to answer.
Yeah. So I would imagine with the next gens in particular that there's a certain level of social intelligence and emotional intelligence that comes into play in navigating this. So what's that role for the next gen?
It becomes an interesting kind of push-pull dynamic between the current leadership and the next-gen leadership. And this is something that we often talk about as best practices for current leadership, but we don't often talk about what best practices are for the next-gen. So the next-gen, using their emotional intelligence skills and their social intelligence skills, needs to be sensitive to the transition that the current leadership is going through, that they need to show up and hold themselves accountable and be good leaders, be good stewards of their family business, but recognizing that they're not the only ones that are going through something. The current leadership is also experiencing a lot of change, and that's hard, especially for those current leaders that have been in charge for so long or had the only one making decisions. It's very hard for them to open that up to a larger group or to a next-gen family member.
Yeah, it's interesting. Beyond technical competence, I would imagine, and understanding of the business, I would imagine that social and emotional intelligence is one of the critical factors for a successful transition, on both the younger generation and the older generation.
Exactly, especially as the next gen comes into the business and is taking on more of a leadership role, they may be promoted more quickly than non-family members that have worked for the business for generations, or for years, for decades. So not only does the next gen need to be aware of what their own family is going through, they need to also be aware of what the larger employee group, and especially non-family members, are going through as well.
Yeah, it's a whole systemic awareness and being able to navigate all those multiple relationships. So from a best practices standpoint, real quick, what are like 2 or 3 that you think we can distill down out of this conversation?
So going back to what we talked about with the tracking decision making, I like to put all of the decisions and major tasks that the current leadership is doing into a spreadsheet, into a timeline, because then you can really map out what they're doing, and that can map their transition also. So you have a line for current leadership and then the next gen leadership, when they're going to observe these decisions, when they're going to kind of co-team making these decisions, and then when they're going to fully take over making those decisions. The other best practice is to have all of these expectations, how you're going to enter the business, laid out well in advance of a next gen family member coming into the business. And that's where a family employment policy becomes key, that maps out requirements for them to enter the business, including outside work experience, or some have an education requirement. Who they're going to work for. Is it a non-family member? Is it a family member? What sort of feedback or review process are they going to have? And then also, which I do this with any agreement that you're entering into with somebody, you also want a way out. So if a family member is entering the business, if it doesn't go well, or they would like to leave the business after all, how do they gracefully exit the business?